This video contains images which some viewers may find distressing. In 1819, Francisco José de Goya y Lucientes, commonly known as Goya, was a successful and celebrated artist. Then suddenly he withdrew from public life, left Madrid and the royal court behind, and moved into a farmhouse in the countryside. His wife and most of his friends were dead, and he had become isolated. He was 73 years old, sick and completely deaf. His long life was coming to a close, but he wasn't finished yet. The man who once painted crucifixions, miracles, saints and priests now painted terrifying, demonic, raw and brutal works. Works without even a hint of God. Francisco Goya's black paintings were created during his later years in Spain, from around 1819 to 1823, and convey his deeply pessimistic view of humanity. He went from being the most famous painter in the country, idolized by an adoring public, to an artist who created his works in total isolation, on the bare walls of his secluded farmhouse, which were never intended for public viewing. He never named them or explained them, and only after his death would they be named the pinturas negras, the black paintings, because of the dark colors he used, the deep dark pessimism, and their diabolical subject matter. To understand his black paintings, we need to first understand how Goya went from royal portraits to the horrors of war, to arrive at this endpoint. Goya was a man from a humble background who rose through the ranks to reach the upper echelons of high society. In 1775, he arrived in Madrid from Zaragoza. At first, he worked on tapestry cartoons for the royal residences, creating painting designs to be woven into tapestries for royal palaces, which gave him his first contact with the Spanish royal family. It was in the tapestry factory that he learned to tell a story. In 1789, the year of the French Revolution, he would be appointed court painter and eventually work for 3 Spanish kings. First, Charles III, the great reformer, then his son, the inept Charles IV, and then his son, the tyrant, Ferdinand VII. In between, he would work for the occupying French king, Joseph Bonaparte. In his 40s, Goya was financially and socially secure, respected and newly bourgeois. But just as he was getting too comfortable, his health took a sinister turn, while at the same time, Spain went through some of the most enormous political and social upheavals in its history, and Goya was in the thick of it. He had started life at the royal court as a naturalistic painter of the upper classes, but slowly he underwent an unexpected revolution of his own, from the light to the dark. In 1792, when Goya was 46, he developed a mysterious illness. He survived but went completely deaf. This profoundly impacted his art as he began to explore a more personal vision, which became increasingly visionary and enigmatic. He started to produce his most subversive work. He created Los Caprichos in his 50s. The disasters of war were produced in his 60s, and then the black paintings he made in his 70s. His later work was mostly produced in secret, while he was still an employee of the court. Goya would be a pragmatist in public, but a revolutionary in private. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, ousted the recently crowned Ferdinand VII, and crowned his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, King of Spain. Goya remained in Madrid during the occupation by the French and even worked for them. This would have serious implications for him later when the French were expelled and the Spanish monarchy was restored. For many Spanish liberals like Goya, the French invasion was complicated. Like many dictators then and now, Napoleon came in with talks of restoring democracy. Ferdinand was a despised dictator, and Goya and his liberal friends had initially supported the aims of the French Revolution. They saw French rule as the great hope of liberalization and enlightenment. And in fact, one of the first things Napoleon did was to abolish the hated Inquisition. But the truth is that under occupation, Goya's opinion of the French changed, after personally witnessing the violent subjugation of his countrymen by the occupying troops. The war and its ensuing atrocities affected him and his work deeply. And we start to see a darker subject matter, emotional work which shows deep fear for Spain's future. After a brutal suppression, Spanish rebels started a campaign of guerrilla warfare. There would be repercussions, but eventually Napoleon would be forced out in 1813, and King Ferdinand VII, who had been living in exile, was reinstated. Goya had started his royal career with Ferdinand's grandfather, the beloved Charles III, a king who believed in religious reform and a constitutional monarchy. The painter and the king had much in common, following many of the principles of the Enlightenment, an intellectual and philosophical movement that had spread throughout the world, that placed reason over superstition and science over religion. All over the world, great thinkers were talking of a wall of separation between church and state. But Ferdinand VII declared himself absolute monarch. He rejected any type of modernization, reinstated the Inquisition and gave the church more power, revoked the constitution, clamped down on dissent with an iron fist, and began the process of dragging Spain back into the Dark Ages. When Goya produced his series on the monstrosities of war and human behavior, called Los Desastres de la Guerra, or The Disasters of War, he wrote on one of them, "No se puede mirar." One cannot look at this. To this day, some of his work is hard to look at. In some strange way, his deafness and the isolation that came with it gave him freedom to work in a more experimental vein, rather than something a patron had demanded. His darker work, however, would either be censored or not even see the light of day. Francisco Goya was a truth teller, but not everybody wanted to hear the truth. This work was painted just before Goya was struck deaf. And this was painted after. From 1792 on, Goya's private world would be stripped of colour and light. The artist said he saw scenes like Yard with Lunatics in the asylum of Zaragoza. It shows a scene of violence occurring in an open courtyard of an insane asylum. But despite the yard being open to the skies, the inmates are shrouded in darkness. The dark subject matter and the use of shadow to represent ignorance would prefigure his later etchings. Goya's series of aquatint prints, Los Caprichos and the Disasters of War, has long been recognized as one of the supreme monuments of European art. Intaglio is the name for any technique in which the image is cut into the surface, and the cut line or sunken area holds ink. Achieving aquatint tones is a very complex printing process, but here is a rough idea. For the initial design, a copper plate is heated, then it is covered with a waxy, acid-resistant ground. Then, a design is drawn onto the wax ground with an etching needle, and so exposing the surface of the plate. Because the drawings are etched into soft, waxy ground, rather than directly to metal, for example, as here in the case of engraving, the etched line is typically clean and can be delicate, intricate, and spontaneous, like drawing or watercolor. The etching is done back to front, including all the writing, if there is any, as the final print will be the reversed image. Once the design is etched, the plate is immersed in a bath of acid. Where there is still wax on the plate, the acid doesn't bite. However, the lines that were etched and so exposed by the artist get attacked by the acid, leaving their design embedded in the surface in grooves which will hold ink. Gradations of line tone can be achieved by varying the length of time in the acid bath. Longer periods produce more deeply bitten areas, which print as darker lines. The plate is then covered with ink, which is pushed into those grooves. Then most of it is lifted off, leaving the grooves holding ink. The paper is soaked in water, then laid on top of the inked-up plate, and then it is run through the press. This initial engraving is the first stage before adding aquatint tones. Aquatint is used to create tonal effects rather than lines. Here we can see 3 stages of an aquatint print. At first, the etched design is printed. Then one tone is added, and then another is added. To make these tonal areas, the same plate is dusted with an acid-resistant material called powdered rosin, which is attached by heating. The plate is then immersed in an acid bath just like when etching, and the acid eats into the metal around the dust particles to produce a grainy sandpaper-like surface, which holds enough ink to give the effect of an area of wash when inked or printed. On the 6th of February 1799, the popular newspaper Diario de Madrid carried an ad from Francisco Goya announcing the publication and sale of a series of new etchings. He stressed in the public announcement that in none of the compositions that form this collection has the author proposed to ridicule the particular faults of one or another individual. In other words, the work came with a disclaimer. Goya published a series of 80 etchings and aquatints called Los Caprichos, or the Caprices, in which he took the opportunity to show the hypocrisies and follies of an unenlightened population, while critiquing the vanity and ignorance of contemporary society. The technique of aquatint allowed artists to create a watercolor look, and Goya became a master at using a broad range of contrasting aquatints to reveal the shadowy world of ignorance. Goya may have started them as early as 1795, when even pre-Napoleon, the political situation in Spain had changed dramatically. The reign of Charles IV was dominated by crisis after crisis. Wars with revolutionary France and then England weakened Spain's economy. The government attacked the press and censored political views. But interestingly, social satire like Los Caprichos flourished. Goya had not long been struck deaf, and in recovery he developed a personal interest in the Enlightenment. These ideas were almost certainly an inspiration for his most famous plate from Los Caprichos, number 43, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the man whose words inspired the French revolutionaries, and was now inspiring a Spanish court painter. Words which were censored by both the Spanish Church and the Crown. The frontispiece of Rousseau's 1793 edition of Philosophy bears a striking resemblance to Goya's etching, and it is quite possible that it was this book that sowed the seeds for Goya's own personal enlightenment. The distraught man slumped over the desk is Goya himself. We know this from an earlier preparatory sketch. Goya shows the struggle between reason and imagination. His audience would have recognized the menacing bats and owls as symbols of ignorance and evil. At the lower right, a lynx watches vigilantly, alerting us to the rise of monstrous forces that appear when sleep descends. By the man's hands are the tools of his trade, paper and brushes. An owl is handing over a brush as if to encourage him to continue his work. We know that Goya originally intended this as the title page to the series, rather than the self-portrait he went with. Despite its relegation to plate 43, it has come to symbolize the overall meaning of the series. That is, what happens when reason or rationality is asleep, and superstitious beliefs take over from science and reason, and we produce monsters or monstrous ideas. In Los Caprichos, no member of Spanish society was spared his acid pen. Superstitious peasants and prostitutes, belief in witches, the ignorance of the ruling classes, and most shockingly of all, the Catholic Church, were all targets. Goya's satire of religion was particularly dangerous. Here we see a drunken priest pulling up his trousers after consummating an unspecified sexual act. This plate has a group of clergymen getting drunk besides an enormous barrel of beer, and Goya has them saying, "No one has seen us." We need to remind ourselves of the religious oppression in Spain, where the Inquisition remained a force until 1834. The church had complete control and decided what could be read and what couldn't, what could be taught and what couldn't, and what art was and wasn't acceptable. And if you went against these teachings, you could be persecuted by the Inquisition. Inevitably, Goya was reported to the authorities, and only 2 days after publication, he withdrew the Caprichos from public sale. Luckily for us, in 1803, Goya gifted the original copper plates to the king, who gave them to the San Fernando Academy of Fine Arts, where they remain today. In France, the political revolution inspired by the Enlightenment devolved into violence, leading to Napoleon becoming Emperor of France, which would have direct consequences for Spain. After the Napoleonic invasion, spontaneous rioting broke out, and on May 2, 1808, Spanish citizens rose up against the French occupiers. The next day, the French struck back at dawn, and hundreds of Spanish citizens were rounded up and shot. Goya's painting of one of those executions will stand in for all the brutalities of war. We can debate the ethics or otherwise of Goya working for the occupying Napoleonic court, but we must remember he was the court painter and needed to survive. Being in Madrid meant he could bear witness to the horrors of the war perpetrated by Napoleon's armies, and so he started working in secret and at great personal risk on new etchings which would be called the disasters of war. Some of the ideas from the etchings would inform his 3rd of May canvas. When Napoleon was driven out and Ferdinand VII was on his way back in, Goya approached the provisional government with a request to paint 2 enormous history paintings, one depicting the Spanish rebellion against the French and another set the following day, showing the execution of those Spanish heroes by Napoleonic troops. This was 6 years after the actual event took place, and at a time when Goya's loyalty to the Spanish crown was being questioned. The paintings were done extremely quickly, within a couple of months. Goya had a lot to prove. 3rd of May 1808 is set in the early morning after the uprising. The painting features 2 groups of men. In the shadows is the anonymous firing squad of the French army, melded together as a single unit, an instrument of war. We cannot see their faces, emphasizing the anonymity of oppressors. The contrast between the passion of the pleading victims and the cold mechanical firing squad is what makes this work so intense. The central Christ-like figure is an anti-hero who is about to be executed on the side of the road like a dog, as bodies of slaughtered citizens pile up beneath him. Goya uses him as a symbol of martyrdom, of man's inhumanity to man, and the whiteness of his shirt is there to represent the innocence of all victims. The scene is lit by a lantern on the ground, which if you look carefully is actually only throwing light on the main figure. As well as the crucifixion pose, his hands show the wounds of the stigmata, which Picasso will reference for Guernica, his anti-war painting, along with the pose of the central figure. Lights, candles and lanterns are often tied into images of martyrdom in Christian art, as a metaphor for the presence of God. But in Goya's painting, the light is there to make an easy shot for the firing squad and to force us to witness the atrocity. Goya subverts the whole concept of light and takes God out of the equation.
Fire!
The artist broke the rules of art by creating a war painting that has no heroes, one that shows a powerful state exacting revenge against ordinary citizens. Going back in history, war paintings have always been about opposing armies, about victory. But this is a complete break from the heroic symbols of war. The figures, including a friar, are not heroic, but cower in fear as a mass of blood seeps into the sand. Once more, Goya shows us the truth. But as I said, not everyone wants to hear the truth. In 1813, Fernando was on his way back in. Unbeknownst to Spain, it was just about to go from the frying pan into the fire. And when Ferdinand VII returned to Madrid in 1814, 6 years after he left, he did not approve of the two paintings created in his absence, and so they were put in storage. And there they would remain, hidden from view, for over 40 years. The last thing the newly restored king wanted was to remind ordinary citizens that they also have the power to overthrow their oppressors. This painting is the one against which all future paintings of violent conflict will be measured. A powerful statement on tragedy and abuse of power in the name of liberation. A statement that is as important today as it was 200 years ago. Between 1810, when Goya was part of the French-occupied Spanish court, and 1819, before he went into exile, Goya was working on The Disasters of War, a series of 82 aquatint etchings which take up after May 3rd, 1808. Except, with that painting, it was perfectly clear who were the bad guys and who were the good. But these etchings were much more ambiguous and much more confrontational. They are as hard, if not harder to look at, than his black paintings. He rejects the bombastic heroics of previous war art and shows the effects on individuals. On top of this, he once again dispenses with colour and uses shadow and shade to show its universal truth. These are not propaganda, they are reportage. The artist takes the concepts of patriotism, heroism and triumph and turns them on their head. He had personally lived through this, seen many of these atrocities with his own eyes, and he tells us so. Here it says, "Yo lo vi," I have seen this. He saw people starving to death on the streets, he saw executions, and he saw assaults. Controversially, he is saying that the Spanish can be just as cruel and sadistic as the French. Goya boldly refuses to take sides, and that was something we'd never seen before. We can divide the etchings into 3 groups. The early ones are works about the Napoleonic invasion. The second group concern the famine that followed, when Goya witnessed the mistreatment of the poor by the wealthy. In this etching, the upper-class man cruelly mimics the beggar. And then the final group documents Spain's move towards absolutism and satirize the church. Here, a priest walks on a frayed and tattered rope, as a woman cries, "The rope is breaking." In Goya's original sketch for the print, the precarious crossing was made by the Pope, but in a rare act of self-censorship, Goya downgrades him. For the most part, the etchings transcend specifics. Goya's work is universal because it has deep compassion for all victims of war, and an understanding of suffering which affects all of us and is at the heart of our humanity. Here, a lone survivor is faced with a world of devastation, destruction, and suffering, and he cries out in desperation, "No hay quien los socorra." There is no one to help them. Goya was 62 when he began work on the etchings in secret, and he would finish them under the rule of Ferdinand VII, but they wouldn't get published until 35 years after Goya's death. They were just too incendiary, as he denounces both violence and abuse of power. It would have been impossible to publish them while Ferdinand was still alive. Ferdinand's decision to censor Goya's 2 paintings made it a most difficult time for the artist. He was still under investigation for his role during the French occupation, and thanks to Ferdinand's dislike of him, Goya's commissions dried up. So in 1819, at the age of 73, he moved to a farmhouse in the countryside, where, isolated from the Spanish court, in complete secrecy, he created some of the most extraordinary images in the history of art. What is rarely mentioned is that yes, the farmhouse was isolated, but its position was such that Goya could actually see the royal palace up on the hill from his house. So some of the most politically charged works of his career were created as he overlooked his former life of privilege. Left alone in the dark, he was free to create monsters. Los Caprichos and the Disasters of War were horrific images that he either didn't publish or withdrew immediately because of fear of reprisal. But with the black paintings, he was isolated enough from Madrid that he could express himself exactly how he wanted to, safe from prying eyes. He set about producing an extraordinary cycle of 14 works, painted directly onto the wallpaper of the 2 floors of his house. Goya lived and worked like a hermit, and we don't even know what he called them, as he never mentioned them, signed them, or titled them, and apart from his maid, nobody else saw them. The very fact that Goya created them as fresco paintings instead of the more usual canvas and oil is proof enough that he never expected his paintings to be displayed in public. Goya intentionally created them in private because they were so provocative. In 1863, long after his death, the house was bought by Baron Émile d'Erlanger. He had Goya's paintings along with the wallpaper peeled from the walls and then transferred onto canvas. If you've ever tried to strip wallpaper, you know how impossible that delicate task would have been. Many of the details were lost, and sections had to be repaired by restorers, and some were purposely altered for aesthetic reasons, as we shall see. Luckily for posterity, the paintings were photographed in situ in 1874, before they were removed. And thanks to these images, we have a record of where they were and what condition they were in. There's more than one way to look at these paintings. I think the deafness-madness angle has been overstated. He had been deaf for over 30 years at this point, and there is no evidence of madness in his letters or elsewhere. We have to see them in the context of political and religious turmoil. These are paintings by an old, tired man, stripped of his status and wealth, disappointed and angry with the world, and desperate to express it in the only way he knows how, in paint. There are 14 of them in total, and although they are not necessarily linked thematically, they are linked technically. For most of them, Goya used as his base a thick layer of black paint directly onto the plaster walls, on top of which he created the characters with lighter shades of whites, greys, ochres and earth. The oil palette is very limited and his brushwork is broad, energetic and loose, echoing a morally chaotic world. His brushstrokes are impressionistic, long before the Impressionists existed. Let's look at the theories behind the black paintings one by one. We can see the passage of Goya's disillusionment in this one image. This painting is the exact same subject matter painted by Goya 30 years previously. They show the feast of Saint Isidora, which takes place every 15th of May. When Goya painted it in 1788, it is full of light and joy. But 30 years later, that world had become a nightmare. 30 years which saw the French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, the occupation of Spain, and the horrendous guerrilla war that followed, the extension of the Inquisition, and the restoration of a dictator king. The earlier painting, commissioned for a princess, is a celebration full of young people dancing and drinking and having fun. The later version is the exact same scene, but the sky has turned from glorious sunshine to dark and stormy. Where once the revelers sang along to brass bands, the source of the music is now a lone madman. The once orderly crowd are now a seething mass of madness, no longer laughing but howling in agony. And the reason for their pain is right in the middle of the mass of bodies staring out at us. Napoleon Bonaparte. 20 other political figures have been identified in Goya's black paintings. This to me seems to contradict the belief that the paintings had no real meaning or were purely the product of Goya's psychiatric decline. This painting is said to be another procession to the sanctuary of San Isidro, which is not far from the farmhouse Goya was living in. But the painting is also known as the Inquisition. Goya portrayed many processions and celebrations over the years, from the lighter-toned burial of the sardine to the dark and cruel procession of the flagellants. As far as Spanish liberals were concerned, of which Goya was one, these ceremonies represented ignorance and superstition, something from the past. Goya emphasizes it in this painting by dressing them in 17th century fashions. One of the figures stands out more than others, a man dressed in 17th century clothes with a moustache and a goatee, holding a sword in one hand and a roll of paper in the other. He has been identified as an inquisitor, dressed in the uniquely Spanish style of stiff collar, guardagolia, and wearing a necklace. The figure next to him he is colluding with is a friar, and the surrounding characters are celestinas or procuresses. Goya has portrayed them before, old women who exploit young girls for their own ends. Goya has emphasized these superstitious beliefs aesthetically by having the main character shrouded in complete darkness, while the opposite corner in the distance is full of light. This is a good example of how some of the works were altered by the restorer. If we look at the photo of the Witch's Sabbath before the painting was removed, we see that the original was much wider. The restorer has seen fit to remove the sides of the canvas, ignoring that Goya often used empty space for dramatic effect. This changes the work's center of balance and positions the woman in white nearer the middle of the composition, and so shifting the focus of the painting. The he-goat or Saturn preaches from a small mound. His mouth is wide open, giving instructions to the old crones around him. He is dressed as a priest, which makes an obvious anti-clerical statement. He is surrounded by obsequious women with bestial twisted faces, thought to be witches. Spain was simultaneously marked by the Enlightenment, fervent Catholicism, and a widespread belief in the supernatural. Most people believed in witches. As we saw, Goya has used witchcraft images before in Los Caprichos, and in a similarly themed painting 30 years earlier, he also features a he-goat surrounded by a ring of terrified women. Goya's use of tenebrism throughout the black paintings was popularized by the 17th century Spanish artist José de Rivera, whom Goya admired, as well as his hero Rembrandt, who used tenebrism to heighten dramatic effect. The woman in white looks suspiciously like a nun. The way she is separate from the others suggests she is a new initiate into the coven. This is a dangerous painting. Remember, the Inquisition is still in operation as Goya painted these images. The he-goat and his followers are the very antithesis of reason and enlightened thinking, and this is a bitter critique of a church that would often condemn ideas of science as subversive and accuse enlightened thinkers of being agents of the devil. Here we see two old men, enveloped in an intense blackness which really emphasizes the characters. One man is holding a cane, and another beast-like figure appears to be talking into his ear. It was a common theme of Goya's, insanity or irrationality represented by demons hovering over men. Art scholars have pointed out that the round-shaped mouth in Goya's art often indicates a demon figure's communication. The figure here is actually shouting, so this could be an allusion to Goya's deafness. As with all the other black paintings, we can't be totally sure who's who, but I think this is a self-portrait of Goya, who was well into his 70s at this point, particularly if we compare it with this later self-portrait he created. As Goya didn't name any of the black paintings, over the years the works have been given many titles, and an alternative to this one was The Two Monks, due to the bearded man possibly wearing a monk's habit. But I think there is another explanation. Goya once said that his teachers were nature, Rembrandt, and Velázquez. Goya worshipped Velázquez and was often inspired by his works in the royal collection. This portrait of Francisco Goya by Goya is said to have been based on the Velázquez portrait of Pablo de Valladolid. If we flip the painting of the two old men, we can compare it to a painting created 200 years before the black paintings. We know that Goya admired this particular painting by Velázquez. In fact, he admired the painting so much he reproduced it as an etching, which, as we saw earlier, was created back to front. I don't think it's a coincidence that the character in Velázquez's work is Menippus, a figure from ancient Greece who wrote satire and is known as one of the great cynic philosophers. This would fit in exactly with Goya's thinking. If we compare Two Old Men to the original photo by Jean Laurent, taken before the removal, we can see that the painting was in a poor state of repair, with a large crack in the plaster in the upper right-hand corner. Restoration was not the exact science it is today. and as many of the paintings were smudged, badly cracked, and smeared with plaster, the restorer, Salvador Martinez Cuvels, took the initiative of restoring them to their original state as much as possible, and he was occasionally heavy-handed. However, it is thanks to Cuvels that we the public have access to them today. The man who bought Goya's house after his death, Baron Émile Delange, had planned to sell them at the Universal Exhibition of 1878. But Cuvels was a painfully slow worker, and by the end of 1875, only 4 of the 14 paintings had been transferred from the walls of the house. Luckily for us, this prompted Delange to change his mind and donate them to the Spanish government. It might be worth looking at these 2 paintings together, as they were next to each other in the farmhouse, and are sometimes seen as companion pieces. Both of the works are smaller in scale than the others. Both are vertical and both have a lighter theme, despite being chromatically darker. They also share an identical lighting source. Both works are difficult to interpret due to the poor state of conservation, which lost part of the original paint when transferred from the wall to canvas. Women laughing seems to be the key to this pair of paintings. It is unusual for Goya, as it is overtly sexual and shows a man pleasuring himself as 2 hags or prostitutes laugh at him. Goya was actually quite reserved and prudish, and rarely painted sexualized images, and so perhaps it is one he would have only created in secret. The other, Men Reading, shows a group of 6 men. Shrouded in darkness, 3 men huddle around a newspaper or magazine that the central figure has on his lap. His shirt is illuminated by a triangle of light, which points our gaze in the direction of the newspaper. The men gather around the central character in order to hear him better. 2 more men are in the background. One of them, gazing upwards, was added by the restorer. This work has also been called The Politicians, as it is thought they are discussing a newspaper article about themselves. If so, it would make sense that the historian Francisco Javier de Salas compared the incessant talk of the politicians in Men Reading to the solitary pleasure of the man mocked by 2 women. This is the moment in the Old Testament when Judith and her maidservant cut off the head of the tyrant Holofernes. It is often seen in art as a story of triumph over tyranny, which I discuss in my film about Artemisia Gentileschi. Goya moves away from the simple traditional portrait of the Bible story, takes it out of any specific setting, removes all of the peripheral iconographies, and focuses only on the action. The Judith he portrays could easily be a woman from Goya's time, and that is the point. It is the very immediacy which reminds us of Goya's history with Ferdinand VII. It is quite possible that the tyrant Holofernes is an allusion to the king, and Judith to the Spanish nation. Even behind closed doors, this was a brave and daring choice for an artist with such ties to the crown as Goya had. In parts of Spain, fights where opponents can club each other to death were still allowed in Goya's day. The 2 men, dressed according to Goya's times, are beating the life out of each other. The man on the left is covered in blood, and the man on the right is shielding his face. As they smash each other to a pulp, they slowly sink into quicksand. Or do they? We know substantial changes were made after removal, and the original photo shows that Goya painted the fighters standing in high grass rather than knee-deep in mud. Either way, I think we can see that the scene of brutal and pointless violence is an allusion to the upheaval in Spain, a picture of tribalism, a country tearing itself apart. Goya is saying, this is Spain. This work is also known as The Witches, but to me, the figures seem fairly genderless. We think it was above the doorway to the kitchen where food was delivered to Goya by his maid. In my opinion, it is possible that Goya is going back to a theme he attacked earlier, that of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. In this case, via an allegory of gluttony. As the figures loom forward out of the darkness, the one on the left is attacking the food with gusto, a manic grin on its face, and purposely turning away from the other figure, who is practically a skeleton, already dead and decaying. This is one of the smallest of the series, which means the work was easy to remove and needed little restoration. X-rays show us it was barely reworked, so the brushwork is exactly how Goya intended, and we see that the artist is at his most impressionistic here. Paint is handled quickly, but with the kind of firm hand you only get with a lifetime of experience. This is Goya's interpretation of a mythological subject, the Moirai, or the Sisters of Fate from classical literature. On the left is Clotho, the youngest sister. She is usually seen spinning the thread of life, but Goya has her holding a newborn baby. Lachesis, the second sister, holds a looking glass ready to inspect the thread of life. And Altropos, the eldest sister, is carrying scissors, which she will use to either cut the thread of life or not. Goya has added a fourth figure, not featured in the myth, a man with his hands tied behind his back. Is this Goya, helpless to his fate, controlled by outside forces and unable to stop what is going on around him? I think the peculiar replacement of Clotho's spinning tool with a baby holds a more personal meaning. Goya and his wife had at least 8 children, but only one survived into adulthood. Their married life was plagued by dozens of miscarriages and infant deaths. In classical mythology, the Sisters of Fate are said to appear 3 nights after a child's birth to determine the course of its life. Clotho presides over the moment we are born, and the baby she is holding is still attached by the thread of life. But unfortunately, by the time we get to Altropos, the thread of life has already been cut. The baby's cruel fate is decided, and the fourth figure, possibly Goya, can do nothing to help. La Leocadia is different from the others in the series. He didn't use a black base colour here, and aesthetically, she is a lighter contrast from the more monstrous images. La Leocadia, also known as the Seductress, is based on his maid and probable lover, Leocadia Weiss. As with any of the paintings from the series, the current title was not Goya's own. Most historians believe one of his well-known portraits is of Leocadia. The black painting here bears a strong resemblance to the portrait. After his wife's death, Leocadia moved in with Goya along with her daughter Rosario to care for him. She stayed with him in the countryside until 1824, when Goya, once again under scrutiny, quickly abandoned Spain to live in France. Leocadia followed him with Rosario and stayed there until his death in 1828. He taught the young Rosario how to paint, and she later had a career as a painter in France and Spain. Many people, myself included, think Rosario is Goya's illegitimate child. Leocadia was known to be a striking, good-looking woman for the time. She had a strong, fiery character, and based on Goya's letters, her manner often upset him. He left her out of his will, which was quite common for mistresses. Penniless, she moved into rented accommodation and lived in poverty, selling the occasional Goya drawing to survive. Goya portrays her dressed in a dark, almost funereal dress, worn by the lower-class women of Madrid, known as maja. In reality, Leocadia would not have worn these clothes, as they were beneath her. But Goya was fixated on the majas' elaborate outfits and sense of style in dress, as well as by their cheeky behaviour. This painting, from over 20 years before the black paintings, is of the Duchess of Alba, one of Spain's leading nobles. She is dressed here in elegant and expensive French fashions of the day. Goya was infatuated with her, and 2 years later he painted her in a scandalously low-cut maja outfit, an erotic proletariat type that appealed to Goya. Leocadia leans against what looks to be a burial mound, and the speculation is that it is Goya's grave and that she is there to mourn the end of Goya. Some experts interpret the figure as the personification of melancholy, since she seems to be meditating on life and death. X-ray investigations of the image shows that originally she leant on a door or a fireplace and that she had no veil, signifying mourning, and at some point, possibly a more despondent time, he added a darker theme. We think Leocardia is one of the final works he painted in the series. This one was named by his friend Antonio Brugada, and it is also known by its alternative title, Fantastic Vision. In Jewish legend, Asmodeus was the prince of demons and hell. The main focus here is on the two floating figures, one male and one female. They both seem terrified. She covers her face and is looking in the opposite direction, as if they are being chased. He points to the town at the top of the mountain, possibly the Rock of Gibraltar, which was a refuge for Spanish liberals during the aftermath of the Peninsular War. The crowd, with horses and wagons, appear to be refugees running from danger. In the foreground, facing the figures, are the French army from the 3rd of May 1808, taking aim at the defenseless crowd seeking refuge in Gibraltar. This is the most famous of the black paintings, the most horrific and the most discussed. I think the first thing to say is that it is probably more shocking to us than it was to the 19th century Spanish. We have to see it in the context of the rise of Romanticism and its obsession with the gory and the supernatural, which led to the rise of the Gothic novel and the popularity of entertainment such as phantasmagoria, popular at the time with audiences in Madrid, where images of monsters and ghoulish subject matter were projected in theatres using lanterns. Having said that, the cannibalism angle is particularly grotesque, and it's even more horrifying that Goya painted it on the walls of his dining room. The story is from the mythological tale of the Greek god Kronos. The Romans called him Saturn. In it, Saturn overthrew his father to become the ruler of all the gods. Afraid that history would repeat itself, he ate, or rather swallowed whole, 5 out of his 6 children. But here, Saturn is not swallowing the body whole, but gnawing down on it in a frenzied and horrific attack. It has been tackled before by artists, but Goya's version is different. It is not a baby's body, as in the myth, but a grown adult's, which makes it even more disturbing, and we can back that up with this incredible 1797 sketch Goya did, which clearly shows it was intended to be an adult. Saturn's expression is terrifying. This is not a god reveling in revenge, as gods do. It is not a celebration. Saturn is shocked by his own monstrousness. He is fully aware just how terrible an act he commits against his own flesh and blood. But he just can't stop himself. And that is horrifying. The raw flesh of the figure is the flesh that Goya witnessed all over Madrid as innocent citizens were cut down in the street by armed men. Poverty and hunger left a mass of starving bodies in the city, and piles of corpses were left to rot. Goya had seen hell on earth, and he transcribed what he saw for future generations. But mostly I think this is a painting about power and just how far someone will go to retain power. How Saturn, like Ferdinand, has used power not only to mistreat his own citizens, hence the adult corpse, but also to violently turn on those people. It shows us that those in power will use any means possible to hang on to that power, including eating their own children. For me, the most powerful image is not Saturn devouring his son, but the drowning dog, the most pessimistic and most wretched image of them all. It shows a dog's head gazing upwards, lost in the vastness of the rest of the image, alone and drowning slowly in quicksand. The dog is looking upwards at someone or something outside of the composition. In the original photo, it was discovered that the dog is looking at 2 birds flying in the sky, which disappeared from the painting when it was transferred from the walls to the canvas. To me, the fact he sees birds flying free makes the image even more tragic. We have seen horrific images before in many paintings, but usually, no matter how ghastly, there is salvation. In the black paintings, there is no sense that the sacrifice of human life is going to lead to salvation. In fact, it doesn't, as Saturn is eventually overthrown by one of his sons, and for the dog, there is no salvation, no hope, and there is no God. This dog is Goya's stand-in for humanity, struggling alone. Just like the dog, we are looking to the sky for a miracle that will never come. Goya left Spain at the age of 78 to start over in France, and he died there a patriot in exile 4 years later in 1828. In a macabre twist to the Goya story, in 1901, his body was exhumed for transfer back to Spain, and it was then discovered that his skull was missing. Like the black paintings themselves, there are many theories about what happened to his skull, but ultimately, it remains a mystery. The painter, who was so skilled at getting into other people's heads, eventually lost his own. Goya has been called the most radical artist that ever lived, the last of the old masters and the first of the moderns. But the word that comes up again and again with Goya is truth. He was a prescient artist who became the chronicler of a violent age and gave us uncomfortable truths that are as relevant today as they ever were. He showed us that ordinary people are capable of evil and can do extraordinary things, and that sometimes when we are looking for monsters, we should look within ourselves.